What happens when a 1,500-pound predator ignores a 25-yard safety buffer in less than 4 seconds? On August 14, 2024, a tourist on a photography excursion learned that even a professional guide cannot always stop a determined Kodiak brown bear during a salmon run. August 14, 2024, Kodiak Island, Alaska. The primary bottleneck was geographical isolation and extreme terrain. The location was a tidal beach accessible only by boat, several miles from the nearest medical facility. Thomas Miller, a 31-year-old tourist, was participating in a guided photography excursion. He was accompanied by Sarah Jenkins, a professional wilderness guide with 12 years of local experience. The pair arrived at a coastal salmon stream at 8 a.m. to observe brown bears feeding during the seasonal run. The terrain consisted of wet volcanic sand, jagged rock outcroppings, and dense kelp deposits. A large male Kodiak brown bear was positioned in the shallow water 30 yards away. The animal weighed an estimated 1,500 pounds. Jenkins maintained a stationary position, instructing Miller to remain behind her. Miller moved forward 5 yards to improve his camera angle. The sound of his boots on the wet gravel was audible over the receding tide. The bear ceased feeding and oriented its head toward Miller. It transitioned from a standing position to all 4 limbs. The animal's ears were pinned flat against its skull. The bear initiated a charge from 25 yards. It covered the distance across the soft sand in less than 4 seconds. Miller attempted to retreat, but his foot caught on a submerged rock. Miller fell into a supine position on the shoreline. The bear made initial contact with Miller's upper torso. The force of the 1,500-pound animal caused immediate blunt force trauma. The bear used its front claws to rake Miller's chest and abdomen. Miller attempted to protect his neck with his forearms. The bear engaged its jaws on Miller's right shoulder and began a violent lateral shaking motion. Jenkins reached for her gear and deployed a handheld signal flare. The flare ignited with a loud hiss and emitted a bright red light. She moved within 10 feet of the animal while waving the pyrotechnic. The bear released Miller's shoulder and stood over him for several seconds. It looked at the burning flare and the encroaching guide. The animal then turned and retreated into a nearby boulder field. Jenkins reached Miller at 8:12 a.m. Miller was conscious but experiencing shortness of breath and rapid blood loss. Jenkins applied pressure dressings to multiple deep lacerations on his torso and arms. The remote nature of the beach delayed the arrival of the extraction vessel by 40 minutes. During the transit to the nearest clinic, Miller's pulse became thready and eventually ceased. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation was performed for 20 minutes without success. Medical findings and aftermath. The post-mortem examination of Thomas Miller revealed multiple causes of death. The primary cause was exsanguination resulting from a severed brachial artery and deep thoracic lacerations. Secondary findings included a fractured clavicle, 4 broken ribs, and a significant concussion caused by the initial impact with the ground. The victim was pronounced dead on arrival at the Kodiak Medical Center. There was no evidence of defensive wounds on the bear, indicating the animal was the sole aggressor. The animal was later identified by wildlife officials but was not culled, as the incident was classified as a defensive aggressive response to a perceived territorial intrusion. Sarah Jenkins underwent a formal review by the Guiding Association and was cleared of professional negligence. She was diagnosed with acute stress disorder following the event. She ceased lead guide operations for the remainder of the 2024 season and currently works in a sedentary administrative role within the Alaskan tourism sector. Incident analysis. Safety buffer violation. The victim ignored established safety protocols by moving 5 yards ahead of the guide, entering the predator's reactionary gap. Terrain factors. The uneven, slippery surface of the tidal flats prevented an effective retreat and led to the victim falling, which triggered the bear's predatory chase reflex. Deterrent efficacy. The use of a signal flare was successful in breaking the bear's focus, but the deployment occurred after the victim had already sustained non-survivable injuries. Acoustic masking. The sound of the crashing surf likely muffled the noise of the victim's approach, causing the bear to be surprised at close range. Practical takeaway. In high-density predator environments, visual and physical proximity to a professional guide must be maintained at all times. Even a small deviation in distance can result in a fatal encounter. March 3rd, 2017, the eastern coast of Greenland. The primary bottleneck was the extreme isolation and the structural vulnerability of a soft-sided inflatable boat in a sub-zero marine environment, where any vessel failure becomes a non-survivable event within minutes. Ingrid Solberg, a 34-year-old wildlife documentarian from Norway, was positioned 3 miles from the nearest shoreline. She was operating a small inflatable boat, specifically designed for quiet movement through ice-choked waters. The air temperature was 5 degrees Fahrenheit. The water was 29 degrees Fahrenheit. Solberg wore 4 layers of synthetic insulation and a dry suit. She sat low in the boat, her weight distributed to maintain stability. A satellite phone and a flare gun were secured to her outer gear. At 8:15 a.m., Solberg observed a polar bear cub on a drifting ice floe. The animal weighed approximately 60 pounds. The cub entered the water and swam toward the boat. Solberg remained motionless to avoid a predatory or defensive response. The cub reached the side of the inflatable. It used its front claws to grip the rubberized fabric and pull itself onto the craft. A distinct hissing sound began immediately. The cub's claws had created a half-inch puncture in the primary air chamber. Solberg observed small bubbles forming as air escaped into the water. The boat began to lose pressure. The rubber floor sagged beneath her boots. Solberg's breathing became shallow and rapid. A second, larger animal appeared 40 yards away. An adult female polar bear, estimated at 550 pounds, was swimming at a high rate of speed toward the boat. The female's head remained low in the water. The cub moved toward Solberg's legs. Its wet fur made contact with her trousers. The mother bear produced a low-frequency vocalization. Solberg reached for the flare gun. Her fingers were stiff, causing a 2-second delay in releasing the safety holster. The mother bear was now 15 yards from the boat. Solberg aimed the flare gun at a 60-degree angle. She depressed the trigger. The device produced a sharp mechanical crack and a bright magnesium discharge. The cub moved to the rear of the boat. The mother bear stopped swimming and lifted her chest out of the water. She exhaled a thick cloud of steam. Solberg reloaded a second flare. She fired again. The second explosion occurred closer to the water's surface. The cub exited the boat and entered the water. The mother bear turned away from the craft to intercept the cub. They moved toward a large ice floe 100 yards to the east. Solberg's boat was now significantly deflated. The port side had folded inward. She began rowing toward the rocky shoreline 2 miles away. Each stroke required more effort as the boat lost its rigid shape. She reached the shore 25 minutes later. The boat was roughly 40% deflated upon landing. Medical findings and aftermath. Solberg was evaluated by a local medical officer 3 hours after the encounter. She presented with mild symptoms of hypothermia, including core temperature fluctuation and localized numbness in her fingers. There were no lacerations or puncture wounds from the cub. The primary physical diagnosis was acute stress reaction, characterized by an elevated heart rate and muscle tremors that lasted for several hours post-incident. She did not require hospitalization or surgical intervention. Solberg continued her work in the Arctic, but reported a permanent change in her field protocols. She suffered from recurring dreams involving the sound of escaping air and now avoids the use of soft-sided inflatable boats in known polar bear habitats. Incident analysis. Equipment vulnerability. The choice of a soft-sided inflatable boat created a single point of failure when faced with an animal possessing sharp claws. Deterrent readiness. Solberg's decision to keep the flare gun on her person rather than in a gear bag allowed her to deploy it while the boat was actively sinking. Behavioral trigger. The cub's curiosity was likely the catalyst for the mother's aggressive approach. A mother bear will perceive any proximity to her cub as a lethal threat. Acoustic deterrence. The use of pyrotechnics was effective because it provided both a visual and auditory shock, which disrupted the mother bear's charge without requiring physical contact. Practical takeaway. When operating in predator territories, use hard-sided vessels or reinforced hulls that cannot be compromised by claws or teeth. Ellis Vance, a 71-year-old retired industrial worker, was walking along a remote British Columbia shoreline in 2005 when his path intersected with a high-speed predator fleeing from a separate stimulus. The primary environmental bottleneck was a combination of fading coastal light and a narrowing shoreline constrained by a high tide cycle. Visibility was further reduced by a low-hanging fog bank that had moved inland from the Pacific. The subject was isolated, approximately 800 yards from the nearest human presence. Ellis Vance, age 71, was a retired industrial worker staying at a remote fishing camp. He was on the shoreline collecting driftwood for woodworking. He walked with a pre-existing knee condition that limited his mobility. He carried no deterrents, such as bear spray or a noise-making device. At approximately 8:40 p.m., Vance was positioned on a wedge of wet shale between the tree line and the water. The forest edge consisted of dense spruce and thick moss. The sound of the surf masked auditory cues of movement within the brush. Vance heard the sound of snapping timber. A black bear, estimated at 250 pounds, emerged from the tree line at a full run. The animal moved at a velocity of approximately 25 to 30 miles per hour. It appeared to be fleeing from a stimulus deeper in the forest. The bear's path intersected directly with Vance's position. Vance did not have time to move or deploy a defensive posture. The bear's chest and shoulder struck Vance's upper torso. The force of the impact threw Vance backward onto the shale rocks. Vance's left shoulder absorbed the primary weight of the collision. The humerus was forced out of the glenoid socket. As the bear scrambled for traction to continue its flight, its rear claws engaged with Vance's left hip. The claws penetrated the fabric of his trousers and the underlying dermis. The bear did not stop or engage in a sustained biting sequence. It continued running and disappeared into the timber within 4 seconds. Vance remained prone on the wet stones. He experienced a total loss of motor control in his left arm. The temperature of the air was 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Vance observed the tide moving closer to his feet. He determined that his verbal calls for help were not reaching the camp over the sound of the waves. He began a self-evacuation. He used his right arm to drag his body across the uneven shale. Each movement caused a sharp spike in blood pressure and localized pain in the hip and shoulder. The transit covered roughly half a mile of treacherous terrain. Vance reached the perimeter of the fishing camp after more than 40 minutes of crawling. He was in the early stages of hypothermia. His breathing was labored and his skin was pale. Camp members discovered him near the woodpile and initiated first aid. Medical findings and aftermath. Vance was transported by boat and then vehicle to the nearest medical facility. Doctors diagnosed a complete anterior dislocation of the left shoulder and a 3-inch laceration on the left hip. The laceration required 12 sutures to close. He also suffered multiple hematomas across his back and ribcage from the impact with the stones. The recovery process lasted approximately 6 months. Vance underwent intensive physical therapy to regain a limited range of motion in his shoulder. Due to his age and the severity of the impact, he developed chronic secondary arthritis in the joint, which permanently ended his ability to perform heavy manual labor or carving. Vance experienced lasting hypervigilance regarding the forest edge. He ceased walking the shoreline during the dusk hours. He documented a persistent physical reaction of increased heart rate and shallow breathing whenever he encountered sudden movement in his peripheral vision. Incident analysis. Environmental risk. The narrow geography of the shoreline created a natural pinch point where the human and animal were forced into the same path with zero runoff space. Lack of deterrent. The absence of a bear bell or vocalization meant the animal was unaware of Vance's presence until the moment of impact, preventing a startle response that might have altered its path. Self-evacuation. Vance's decision to crawl immediately prevented him from being overtaken by the rising tide or developing life-threatening hypothermia on the shoreline. Impact mechanics. The injuries were the result of kinetic energy and accidental claw contact during flight rather than a predatory or territorial attack. Practical takeaway. In coastal regions with dense tree lines, walking the tide line at dusk significantly increases the risk of blind encounters. Carrying a high decibel whistle or bear spray provides a tool to alert animals before they reach a collision vector. In February 2025, an encounter at Breaker Point resulted in a fisherman suffering a punctured lung and fractured ribs after a 900-pound Kodiak bear prioritized a 70-pound halibut over human presence. February 10, 2025, Breaker Point, Alaska. The primary environmental bottleneck was a combination of dense coastal fog and significant auditory masking from the heavy Atlantic surf. Elias Thorne, a 40-year-old subsistence fisherman, was working with a partner on a remote stretch of coastline. The men had been active since 6 a.m., operating in rubber waders and insulated jackets. The air temperature was 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The two men had successfully landed a halibut weighing approximately 70 pounds. They moved the fish to a position beside a large section of driftwood, approximately 20 feet from the tree line. Elias Thorne stood with his back to a pile of tangled logs. At approximately 9:15 a.m., a Kodiak brown bear emerged from behind the driftwood. The animal moved at a high rate of speed across the wet sand. Thorne did not observe the approach due to his physical orientation. The bear made primary contact with Thorne's upper torso. The force of the impact propelled Thorne 10 feet horizontally across the beach. Thorne landed on his back in the intertidal zone. He experienced immediate shortness of breath and a temporary loss of motor control in his limbs. The bear transitioned its weight onto Thorne's chest. A dull cracking sound was audible as Thorne's ribcage compressed under the animal's weight. The bear's right forepaw swept across Thorne's left shoulder. The claws caused deep lacerations through the heavy fabric of his jacket and into the underlying muscle. Thorne's partner, standing 15 feet away, experienced a freeze response. His hands shook, and he remained silent, unable to access the sidearm holstered at his hip. The bear did not acknowledge the second person. The predator shifted its focus from the man to the halibut. It used its jaws to puncture the fish, exerting enough pressure to audibly break the halibut's spine. The bear turned away from the fisherman. It dragged the 70-pound catch toward the dense brush. The animal vanished into the fog within seconds. Thorne remained prone on the sand. Blood loss was visible on the surrounding rocks and seaweed. His partner regained motor function and activated an emergency satellite beacon at 9:18 a.m. High output pressure was applied to Thorne's shoulder using a discarded jacket. The fog delayed the visual acquisition of the site by rescue personnel. A medevac helicopter arrived 40 minutes after the initial signal was sent.
Thorn was stabilized on the beach and hoisted into the aircraft for transport to a trauma center in Anchorage. Medical findings and aftermath. Elias Thorn was admitted to the intensive care unit with multiple traumatic injuries. Medical imaging confirmed 4 fractured ribs and a punctured lung, leading to acute respiratory distress. Surgeons addressed deep lacerations on his left shoulder and chest, requiring over 60 sutures to close the wounds. The recovery period lasted 6 months. Thorn underwent intensive physical therapy to restore movement to his left arm, which had suffered minor nerve damage. He eventually regained roughly 80% of his original range of motion, though he remains unable to lift heavy loads above shoulder height. Thorn was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder following the incident. He exhibits significant avoidance behavior regarding coastal environments and has ceased all subsistence fishing activities. His partner also reported long-term psychological distress, specifically regarding his inability to deploy his firearm during the contact event.
Incident analysis. Auditory masking. The sound of the surf and wind prevented the men from hearing the bear's approach through the driftwood. Food proximity. Leaving a high-protein food source like a 70-pound fish exposed near a tree line created an immediate attractant for apex predators. Predatory intent. The bear's behavior was classified as food-motivated rather than territorial. It viewed Thorn as a physical obstacle to the fish rather than a prey item. Physiological response. The freeze response experienced by the partner is a common biological reaction that can render defensive tools, such as sidearms, useless in high-speed encounters. Practical takeaway. When processing or storing large catches in bear country, maintain a 360-degree clear zone and utilize a dedicated lookout who is not involved in the physical labor. A dense morning fog reduced visibility to less than 50 feet and muffled all ambient sound, effectively isolating a vineyard manager from help during a 20-minute siege by a persistent black bear. March 3, 2025, Napa Valley, California. Visibility was limited to less than 50 feet due to a dense morning fog. The moisture in the air muffled ambient sound, isolating the lower vineyard from the main farmhouse. Elena Vance, a 42-year-old vineyard manager, arrived at the lower slopes at 5:45 a.m. She carried a small wooden harvest basket and a handheld refractometer. The ground was saturated from recent rainfall, making the soil soft and difficult to navigate quickly. Vance moved through the rows of Cabernet Sauvignon grapes. She reached a section of the vineyard bordered by a steep wooded ravine. The scent of overripe fruit was heavy in the damp air. Vance observed movement 10 feet ahead. A male black bear, weighing approximately 350 pounds, was feeding on the crop. The animal's fur was matted and wet from the fog. Vance stopped moving. The bear lifted its head from the vines. Juice and pulp were visible on its muzzle. The animal did not retreat. Vance raised her arms and clapped her hands 3 times. She shouted to announce her presence. The bear did not flee. It lowered its head and exhaled a sharp burst of air. The animal shifted its weight forward. It began with a slow, deliberate walk toward Vance. Its upper lip was retracted, exposing its teeth. Vance began to back away toward a stone wine cellar located 60 feet to her rear. She maintained eye contact with the animal. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. The bear increased its pace. The sound of its paws striking the wet earth was audible between its low growls. Vance turned and moved toward the cellar door. The cellar was a reinforced structure with a heavy oak door and a stone frame. Vance reached the iron handle and pulled the door open. She entered the dark interior just as the bear reached the threshold. Vance threw her weight against the door. It closed with a heavy thud. The latch engaged 1 second before the bear made contact with the exterior. The impact of the bear's body caused the wood to vibrate. Vance felt the shock through her palms and shoulders. Dust fell from the ceiling rafters. The animal began to claw at the wood. The sound of the claws scraping the oak was rhythmic and loud. Vance pressed her back against the door to provide additional resistance. The bear struck the door again with its front paws. The hinges groaned, but the stone frame held the door in place. Vance remained silent and attempted to control her shaking hands. A musky odor from the predator began to drift through the gaps in the doorframe. Vance could hear the animal's heavy respiration on the other side of the wood. The bear began pacing the perimeter of the small building. It returned to the door every few minutes to deliver another strike. Each blow was followed by the sound of the animal testing the metal latch with its teeth or paws. Vance remained in a braced position for approximately 20 minutes. At 6:15 a.m., the sound of a diesel engine approached from the vineyard's upper entrance. Vance's husband was arriving in a utility vehicle. The bear's pacing became irregular and faster. The animal struck the door a final time. It then retreated toward the ravine. Vance heard the sound of breaking branches as the bear entered the tree line. A team from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife arrived shortly after. They located the bear on the edge of the property. The animal was immobilized with a tranquilizer dart and relocated to a remote wilderness area. Medical findings and aftermath. Elena Vance was evaluated at the scene by emergency medical technicians. She presented with a heart rate of 115 beats per minute and localized muscle tremors. No lacerations, punctures, or blunt force injuries were recorded. She was cleared of immediate medical concerns, but reported a temporary loss of fine motor control in her hands for several hours following the event. In the months following the incident, Vance reported persistent difficulty sleeping and an increased startle response to low-frequency sounds. She was diagnosed with acute stress disorder and underwent 6 months of cognitive behavioral therapy. She returned to her duties at the vineyard, but no longer enters the fields before sunrise or without a communication device. The cellar door sustained significant structural damage. Deep grooves, some measuring over an inch in depth, were carved into the oak. The iron latch was bent by the force of the bear's weight. The vineyard has since installed high-tensile electric fencing around the perimeter of the lower slopes to prevent further predator incursions.
Incident analysis. Environmental bottleneck. The dense fog and early hour reduced the victim's reaction time and prevented her from seeing the predator until she was within a critical 10-foot radius. Effective action. Using the stone wine cellar as a hard barrier was the primary factor in Vance's survival. A standard wooden shed would likely have failed under the animal's 350-pound weight. Aversive conditioning failure. The bear's refusal to flee when Vance clapped and shouted indicates the animal had become habituated to human presence and viewed the vineyard as a primary food source. Isolation issues. Vance was working alone without a radio or bear spray. If the cellar door had not been unlocked, she would have had no means of defense or escape. Practical takeaway. When working in high-density predator zones during harvest season, carry a deterrent like bear spray and ensure immediate access to a hardened shelter or vehicle. If you value these true survival stories, please hit that red subscribe button right now. It helps our channel grow so we can keep sharing these vital lessons. In August 2009, a wildland firefighter survived a pursuit by a grizzly sow after using a non-lethal noise deterrent. Despite a fall during the retreat, the encounter resulted in a zero fatality outcome
for both the humans and the bears involved. The visibility in the northern Alberta foothills was reduced to less than 50 feet. Thick gray smoke from a nearby wildfire had settled into the valleys. The wind was low, preventing the haze from clearing. The primary bottleneck was the combination of extreme heat and limited sight lines within the dense undergrowth. Carlos Mendez, a 38-year-old wildland firefighter, was working alone on a section of the fire line. He had 12 years of experience in high-stress environments. His task was to clear a fuel break using a hand tool to remove dry vegetation. The sound of the fire was a constant, low-frequency roar. Ash settled on his yellow Nomex suit and soaked into the sweat on his skin. He moved slowly through the brush. The ground was uneven, covered in loose soil and charred roots. Carlos stopped to adjust his gloves. A shift in the smoke revealed a movement 20 feet ahead of his position. The haze parted. A female grizzly bear stood in a clearing. She weighed approximately 450 pounds. 2 cubs were positioned directly behind her. The bear lowered her head. Her ears were pinned back against her skull. Carlos stopped moving. He did not have a firearm or bear spray on his belt. His only equipment was his hand tool and a small pressurized air horn kept in a chest pocket. The bear was trapped between the fire line and the human subject. The grizzly emitted a low growl. She began a rapid displacement toward Carlos. Carlos turned and ran toward a steep downhill slope. He dropped his clearing tool to reduce weight. His boots struggled for traction on the loose embankment. He moved roughly 30 feet down the incline. A buried root caught his left boot. Carlos fell forward. His body struck a cluster of jagged rocks on the slope. He slid several feet before stopping. The bear continued the pursuit. Carlos scrambled to his feet. His breathing was rapid and shallow. His hands were shaking, making it difficult to reach his chest pocket. The bear reached the edge of the clearing. She was now less than 15 feet away. Carlos extracted the air horn. He pressed the actuator. A 120 decibel blast echoed through the trees. The bear stopped. Her front paws skidded in the dirt. She shook her head side to side. Carlos held the blast for 3 seconds. The cubs retreated into the thicker smoke. The sow stood her ground for several seconds, huffing loudly. Carlos activated the horn a second time. The sound was sustained and piercing. The grizzly turned. She followed the cubs into the unburned timber. Carlos remained standing until the sound of breaking branches faded. His heart rate remained elevated for several minutes. He began to climb back toward the fire crew's location. Medical findings and aftermath. Carlos Mendez suffered a deep, 4-inch laceration to his right forearm caused by contact with jagged rock during his fall. He also sustained multiple contusions on his ribs and left hip. At the base camp, the wound was irrigated and closed with sutures. There were no internal injuries or bone fractures reported. The subject returned to light duty after 10 days. The physical scarring on his forearm is permanent. Due to the high-stress nature of the encounter, Mendez experienced several weeks of sleep disruption and hypervigilance while working in forested areas. Mendez continued his career in wildland firefighting, but modified his safety protocol. He now carries bear spray in a quick-access holster on all assignments. The incident led to a mandatory reevaluation of wildlife safety distances for fire crews operating in the Alberta region. Incident analysis. Environmental bottleneck. The wildfire acted as a barrier, forcing the predator and the human into a shared corridor with no easy escape route for the animal. Gear retention. Carlos dropped his primary tool during the flight phase, which reduced his weight but left him without a physical deterrent if the bear had made contact. Auditory deterrent. The air horn proved effective in this instance because the bear was not yet in full physical contact and was startled by the unnatural frequency. Physical reaction. The subject's fall was a direct result of attempting to run on unstable, ash-covered terrain. Falling during a grizzly encounter significantly increases the risk of a predatory or defensive strike. Practical takeaway. When working in high predator zones with low visibility, secondary deterrents like bear spray or air horns must be kept in a no-fail position on the body, accessible even during a fall.